I'm Dr. Erica Bove, and welcome to the Love and Science podcast. I'm your host, and also the founder of Love and Science, Thriving Through Infertility. I'm so excited you're here today. With over a decade of experience helping thousands of women just like you, I empower professional women to build their families with confidence and compassion. Let's dive in. Hello, my loves, and welcome back to the Love and Science podcast. Today, we're going to talk about a very common question, which I get asked a lot, which is progesterone levels, interpretation. What do they mean? What can I glean about the potential success or failure of my cycle? There's so many things to talk about. Okay, so let's start by talking about the physiology of progesterone. Progesterone is a hormone that is secreted exclusively in the luteal phase, which means we ovulate an egg. The follicle that is our dominant follicle starts to make progesterone. The progesterone level rises. It, reaches a peak, right, with corpus luteum production within the first few days of the ovulation event. And then if an embryo implants, that's fantastic because the HCG from that embryo is in the serum, and that stimulates the corpus luteum to keep making more progesterone. However, if the embryo does not implant, then our corpus luteum dies off, and then we have the withdrawal of both estrogen and progesterone, and the endometrium breaks down, and we start to have our period. So that is the physiology of progesterone. Now, this is something I didn't appreciate till I was a fellow, but progesterone is actually secreted in a pulsatile way. And so, interestingly, you can have a progesterone level that varies by like 30 points within even a few hours. You'd have to have an indwelling monitor catheter to be able to really assess true progesterone levels on a minute-to-minute basis. So when people check a progesterone level, say in the mid-luteal phase, it's really interesting because the questions that go through my mind as a specialist are, is that the peak level? Is that the trough level? What are we really looking at? Because, if a progesterone level is like 7 and that's the peak, well, maybe that's not so great. But if a progesterone level is 7 and that's the trough, well, maybe we're not doing so badly, right? And so again, we get one snapshot into time on something that is secreted in a pulsatile way. So I actually tend to look at progesterone secretion as, quantitative instead of qualitative, because it's like, well, okay, is this a yes or no event, right? Did ovulation happen if the progesterone's over 3? Did ovulation not happen, right? It's more of like a yes or no. But to assign any qualitative value to that number is really, really hard to do, right? So if I say, oh, that was a good ovulation event or that was a crappy ovulation event, it's really hard to make those determinations because I don't really have much to stand on unless I had like a zillion values over time, and nobody's going to get poked that many times for that blood work. Now, I will say another reason why progesterone, checking is problematic is because it doesn't always reveal the choreography of the menstrual cycle. So say I see somebody in my office, I'm thinking that they might have PCOS. Sometimes we get like a progesterone level, right? That's sort of what is taught to us in some of our training for the evaluation to get a mid-luteal progesterone if we know when somebody might have ovulated. And, what I say is if I catch somebody ovulating, but they have irregular cycles, I still know that they have ovulatory dysfunction. And so I actually tend not to get a progesterone in those circumstances because I can tell by the history alone if somebody has ovulatory dysfunction, most likely. I mean, if somebody has regular cycles and if they're really not sure if they're ovulating, sure, we can get a day 21 progesterone, right? In a 28-day cycle, that will be revealing. But usually if I have the menstrual cycle length data and people generally know when their LH kids are turning positive or not, with that information alone, I can usually do just as good, if not better, than if I have progesterone levels to work with. So again, if I catch somebody ovulating in the context of ovulatory dysfunction, it's not really going to change how I think about them or how I treat them. Hello, my loves. I am so excited to share this news with you. If you are a female physician navigating the fertility journey and you want a structured, evidence-based plan, I have created a free resource for you. It's called the Physician Fertility Roadmap. I have created a guide to help you optimize your chances of pregnancy and a successful outcome over the next 6 to 12 months. Check out the link in the show notes. Love you. Bye. Okay, so what about IVF? There's been a lot of attention with progesterone and progesterone levels recently in IVF. So it's a little tricky because we have frozen embryo transfer cycles that are programmed where all of the progesterone comes from the outside world, right? So the ovaries are quiet. All the progesterone is being given either by progesterone and oil daily or a combination of progesterone and oil and vaginal progesterone. And the big question is, okay, well, what is an adequate luteal phase progesterone so that we know that the embryo has everything it needs to stick and stay, right? Because interestingly, the study that showed vaginal progesterone only didn't have a change in pregnancy rates, but the ongoing pregnancy rates were lower, which actually suggests that progesterone is really important in terms of pregnancy maintenance. So, if we are looking at data, and I just reviewed this week, it seems that a progesterone level of 10 in an IVF cycle is sufficient to say, yes, in fact, this is a high enough level that we can proceed. Now, if it's under 10, is that bad? I mean, say some of the proportions coming from vaginal progesterone, and we know that there is a local absorption effect that is not reflected in the serum, it's probably not. But I think those of us who do a lot of this work really don't want that variable in the mix. And so you might hear your REI say, we want your progesterone level at usually 15 is what I hear. That's kind of why we continue progesterone until 10 weeks, not 8 weeks, because we like that little buffer. That extra 5 points of progesterone is probably enough of a buffer that we can say we want the progesterone level to be, above 15. Now, 10 is probably sufficient. But again, that's what most of us say. Is there such a thing as a progesterone level that is too high in an IVF setting? That's really controversial. Some studies say no. Other studies say around 30 or 40 that maybe outcomes are worse. And I think we still haven't really definitively answered that question. It's also a lot harder in sort of these modified natural FETs because some of the progesterone might be coming from the ovaries in that pulsatile faction, like we talked about, and maybe some is coming from the outside world. And so I think it can get really, really tricky in terms of what is the goal in those sorts of cycles. But I think that if we can come back to physiology and understand that checking progesterone levels, especially in these natural cycles, can be very problematic. It can really just say if somebody has ovulated or not. In IVF cycles, we do our best to simulate as much of a menstrual cycle as possible, right, with the appropriate levels. And then we do our best to move forward. Also, just thinking about recurrent pregnancy loss and luteal phase defect, the same thing applies. If I think that somebody has a, progesterone issue because they're having premenstrual spotting or their luteal phases are a little short and they keep having miscarriages, I'll give them supplemental progesterone. And then, my patients are like, hey, well, can you check my progesterone level? And I'm like, well, we can, but the progesterone you're taking is going to kind of really cloud the picture. And so, I think it can get really tricky, but really supplementing with progesterone is not really a big deal. And so if that's something that your REI thinks would be beneficial for you, just know it can be a little messy, it can be a little cumbersome, but at the end of the day, sometimes it can really make a big difference for some people. Is there anything else to say about progesterone? Now, I will say that thinking about progesterone in terms of overall pregnancy success, that's something that I get questions a lot as an REI, especially about well, can you check my progesterone level? I'm newly pregnant. I want to really know if this is a good pregnancy. And the problem with that, though, is, under a progesterone level of 5, probably not a great pregnancy. If the progesterone level is above 25, then maybe that's a good sign, right? Assuming no exogenous progesterone exposure. But there's a huge gray zone, right? Between 5 and 25 can be very confusing. And so oftentimes, if the pregnancy isn't good in and of itself, that will reflect in poor pregnancy levels. So then it becomes like the chicken or the egg. And so generally speaking, I don't recommend checking, progesterone levels in natural cycle pregnancies because I don't find that it really helps in any meaningful way. For people who have bleeding and they're concerned about pregnancy maintenance, you can give supplemental progesterone in those situations. Like I said before, also for IVF, we can give it in those situations as well. But I think that the point is when I think about giving somebody supplemental progesterone, it's usually based on the clinical history and not so much the serum values. And so try not to get too bogged down in the actual number. And I think, my patients and my clients do a lot better under those circumstances, just because we follow the evidence, we follow the data, and that kind of obsessive checking does not help. So I hope you found this helpful. Stay tuned for more sciencey episodes. Until the next time. I love you. Bye.